You were the only one who really had faith in the voters, Batman.
I'm ashamed of myself.
We're all ashamed, Batman. While we were ready to desert the ship, you never lost your courage. You brought us safely through.
I never would have believed that the polls could be wrong.
There have been other candidates who've trusted too much in the polls, Mayor Linseed, and they found out that it's the votes that count. Smart politicians trust the voters, not the polls. After all, if you can't trust the voters, whom can you trust?
I'll win this election by hook or by crook.
At least you have choices, Pinky.
If you don't have a board of electors, you can't count the votes. If you can't count the votes, you can't announce a winner.
That's real sharp thinking.
So, hang the polls and hang the pollsters.
I told you not to count those hobos down at the freight yards.
What about the 2 sword swallowers and the lady wrestler you turned in?
Nobody will ever listen to us again.
Don't worry. We can always get a job rating TV shows.
The guy's done like 45 years of campaigning. It's kind of tiring. People in politics, I'd say the majority of them, have different metabolism. They don't need as much sleep. They don't look like when they don't get a lot of sleep. You know, point him in the direction and he goes, and with enthusiasm and verve, guy looks like $1 million.
I present to you the Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden.
What makes somebody get up one morning and say, you know, I can be president? I mean, when you think about it, it is the most outrageous thing that anyone could think about. I can govern the free world, man. I can be the leader of the free world. I think the most important thing it takes is that you actually really know what you want to do and you believe you can do it. Across the country, we're doing really well based on our calculations, and we're feeling really good about it. So you must be doing a good job. Not just here, all across the country. The biggest threat to Hillary Clinton is lack of turnout. So we're going to need your help. What I don't want you doing, I don't want you waking up the next morning and saying, you know, if I had made 10 more calls, it'd be a different story. I know I'm always referred to as middle-class Joe. In Washington, that's not meant as a compliment. It means that I am not sophisticated. Well, I'm pretty damn sophisticated about what built this country. I'm pretty damn sophisticated about why we are who we are. America's all about possibilities. Those disenfranchised folks who say they're voting for Trump, there's not a single solitary thing that are going to actually increase the standard of living for hard-working, decent people. Look, folks, my word is a Biden. Hillary understands it. That was my father.
Yeah, I know.
You're a man of your word. Without your word, you're not a man. Remember, you're a Biden, like it's so like we're a tutor or something.
Yeah.
You know?
Or say grandchild gets to be a teenager and says, "Great-grandpapa, explain how Donald Trump became the Republican nominee."
I think the Republican Party for the last 8 to 10 years has been dumbing down the system. I think that, but I don't think I made a mistake. I mean, I feel sometimes like I feel sometimes like I let my son down in not running. But the flip of that is, you know, like I said before, and I really mean it, no one should run unless they are ready to give their whole heart and soul to this and they feel emotionally completely in control of themselves and their family. And I think this would have been a very, very difficult race from the primary through the general election. I mean, I remember when some folks thought I was going to run, and I started seeing articles that Joe Biden's running and going to say he's doing it because he's taking advantage of his son's death. You know, there was no way I could put my family through it, let alone me. So I don't regret that. I don't think I made the wrong decision. But I'm going to be blunt about it. I think there are certain things at this moment in our history that I was pretty, not uniquely, but pretty well suited to deal with. Mainly, and whomever's the next president is going to have an overwhelming difficulty bringing the country together and the parties together. That's something I've been relatively good at.
Ladies and gentlemen, live from the Steiner Resort in Pine Woods, New York, Mr. Wide World of News, Mark Halperin.
I've been observing the country through the prism of presidential politics and politics now for a long time, back since I started my career in 1988. And I think I'm qualified to talk about America, even though I've not been allowed to travel very much this cycle so far. I try to always be optimistic and forward-looking. I think that some people still look at political reporters who travel a lot and say it makes them more cynical. It's only made me more idealistic and given me the desire to be part of trying to figure out where we can go with this country to be in a more optimistic direction. Two things happened in 2020 in politics, not the pandemic, not the economic crisis, but two things happened in politics that I think left some people a little bit confused and in some cases upset. One is for Biden supporters, Donald Trump just got 73 million votes. That's a lot and more than a lot of people expected he would get. And then second is the Democratic Party almost nominated a socialist as their presidential nominee. And that's something that a lot of people thought was extremely perilous, dangerous, and they were concerned that that would lead to Donald Trump being reelected. So I want to talk about the country, as I said, and then I'll move to talk about the Democrats and then the Republicans. In terms of the country, I think that it's easy to look at the defeat of Donald Trump, the election of Joe Biden, and say that the country's now headed in a different direction, that things are changed. And I think that would be a mistake. I think there's some fundamentals, what I call the big bad four. These are four factors that predate Donald Trump. They still exist with us now. And they're things that Donald Trump, I think, took advantage of. I think he made them worse in some ways, but I think they account for both Donald Trump's election, Donald Trump getting as many votes as he did, and Bernie Sanders almost becoming the Democratic nominee. The first is the economic decline. We all know whether we're enjoying the prosperity the United States has provided for so long now or not. We all know that this country has gone through a long period of economic decline, in part because of the decline of manufacturing, but also agriculture and foreign competition. This is a time when whether you're a laid off 55-year-old or you're a 20-something looking for your first job, even pre-pandemic, there was a real sense grounded in statistics and in reality that the United States economic system was not working for people. And that's a strongly held view on the far left, on the far right, and a lot of people in the middle, just that the economy is not working the way it once did. Second, and I think deriving from that, which we've seen not just in this country, but in other countries and throughout history, is a rise of populism. A populism which can be positive. We all know that there's aspects of populism that are good, but this is an angry populism, an anti-establishment populism, a populism that says we need change and we need it now, and that the elites that are in charge have done damage to the United States and are in part responsible for the decline in the economy. The third big bad thing, I think, is the absence of meaning in people's lives. People feeling disconnected from their communities, in some cases even from their own families, and looking for meaning, whether they get it through media, whether they get it through politics, but a real absence of people's feeling connected to society and absence of meaning. And then finally, the one that probably gets as much attention as any of the four is the polarization and the partisanship. We see that, right now so dramatically in the context of this presidential campaign, in the context of the media, and the absence really of unifying voices, where the loudest voices on the national town square tend to be the angriest ones. In my focus group we did this past week, we asked the four Biden supporters, four Trump supporters, how they would feel if their candidate lost. Take a look at that.
Raise your hand, please, if the candidate you voted for loses the election, is pronounced the loser eventually. Raise your hand if you think, therefore, the election would have been stolen from your candidate. Raise your hand.
Yes.
If your candidate loses, it will have been stolen.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. All of you think that. Okay.
Wow.
Not surprised, a little disappointed, but not surprised.
So again, that's four Biden supporters, four Trump supporters. Now, that was after the election, and the Biden supporters made it clear that they meant, given what had happened, that they'd seen the returns. But it's still pretty striking. That's not an answer you would have gotten in previous years. And as I said, these four factors, the decline in the economy, the rise of populism, the absence of meaning in people's lives and their search for meaning, and then this partisanship and polarization, all I think are part of what Joe Biden will inherit. They're things that were very much on the mind of the Donald Trump's three predecessors, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Barack Obama, all by inclination and intent. When they ran for president the first time, saw those factors. They understood them very well. In some cases, they harnessed them. But for the most part, they wanted to change the country. They wanted to bring back the economy. They wanted to try to restore or reduce, rather, some of the levels of anger. They wanted to add meaning to people's lives. They had various different ideas about that, but some overlap. And they all very much wanted to change the level of partisanship, the level of polarization. And I would say all three failed. All three, despite the aspiration, despite the fact that you really couldn't find three people in the country, I think, better qualified to try to address those four problems, all of them to a large extent failed. And that gave rise to Donald Trump. Donald Trump, as I said, understood these things. When Barack Obama was president, and there was so much happiness in some parts of the country, so much anger in others. I was talking to a voter in North Carolina, and he said, "There's two things I don't like about this guy," meaning President Obama. I said, "What are they?" He said, "He's a communist, he's a socialist, he's a Kenyan, he's a horrible man, he's a Muslim. I just can't stand him." And I said, "Well, what's the second thing?" And he said, "He's failed to bring us together as a people." And I think that's kind of split personality in the country doesn't exist within everybody, but it certainly exists within every community. People who hoped, even for Donald Trump, who's become more polarizing as he leaves office than his three predecessors, even for Donald Trump, hoped that he would be able to bring the country together. And after three straight two-term presidents, we have a one-term president. He failed as well. And as I said, he really rode this big bad four into office. He understood it. He really was someone who recognized that if people want to burn the place down, the person to be is the chief arsonist. And that's what he was. And make no mistake, that desire to change the status quo, no jobs, no meaning, polarization, and this real fiery populism, that is just as true as for the Tea Party movement as it is for Black Lives Matter on the far left and the far right. A higher percentage of the country than I think a lot of people in the establishment still to this day understand. They really were determined to make change. And all three of Trump's predecessors understood that, but they tried to harness it. They tried to take it and change it by understanding it. This president has basically, in both getting to office and using the powers of the office, just wrote it, understood that was the source of his power, understood quite well that was the public mood. People ask me all the time over the course of the Trump years, what's he like, for those who haven't met him? And I always say he's in some ways a very simple person. He's complicated in some ways, but in some ways a very simple person. If you say nice things about him on television, he will call you up and tell you how smart you are. And that's how I met Donald Trump. I saw him give a speech at CPAC in 2011 when he was thinking about running for president that year against Barack Obama. And he gave a speech at CPAC that was extraordinarily well received. And most of my colleagues who covered it, treated it like it was kind of a joke, treated it like he was a carnival barker. And certainly there were lines in that speech that were typical Trump. They were intended to insult or incite.
And I will fight to end Obamacare and replace it. We don't have free trade. We don't have fair trade. And I'm a fair trade believer. I love open markets. But not when China's manipulating their currency, not when all of these other factors are taking place. We are rebuilding China. We're rebuilding China. You go to China right now, they're building the biggest airports in the world, the greatest airports, the best everything. And they're doing it because we buy so much of their product. And the reason we buy their product is because their currency is so low, and they have it artificially so low, that it makes it almost impossible for our companies to compete. Now, I'll tell you the one thing that's very important. Our companies make a better product. That's very important to know. We make a better product. I wish there was a candidate that I saw that would be fantastic, because I love what I'm doing. In fact, I have a great club that's 15 minutes away. By the way, Ron Paul cannot get elected, I'm sorry to tell you.
of what he said and the reaction it got from the crowd, I saw as quite powerful. CPAC, as many of you know, is an annual event where a lot of people thinking of running for the Republican presidential nomination show up to talk. And Trump had the best received speech. And so I went on television and I said, not only was it well received, but focus on what he said. The themes he talked about, the substantive ones, apart from the insults, were things that everyone listening here would soon hear and would understand to be part of Donald Trump's appeal. Trade, China, the establishment, the importance of shaking up how things are going in Washington, the long-term decline of the American economy and his claim that he could turn that around. Donald Trump understood a lot about what was going on in America. And as I said, he gave people the impression that he was going to fix it. When he talked about change, he talked about it in a fiery and aggressive way. He was a populist all the way back to 2011. And then when he ran in 2015, 2016, same thing. And even as he served in office, you may not like his policies. You may not like how he took advantage of the big bad four, but you shouldn't doubt the fact that A, he understood it, and B, those sentiments are alive right now. Joe Biden, I would tell you, and sort of my central point for the evening, Joe Biden is the opposite of someone like Donald Trump, someone who speaks with passion and understanding about the big bad four. He is as about as establishment a figure as one could imagine. And the great irony to me is a guy who is so pro-establishment, such a creature of the establishment, has been elected at a time when the big bad four are just as raging now as they were when Bill Clinton took office, when George Bush took office, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. Joe Biden is not someone who is a populist. Joe Biden is not someone who I believe has ever talked about the economy in a way that is fundamental to understanding the transformation into the post-industrial age, into the information age. Joe Biden is not someone who people think of as necessarily understanding why people don't find meaning in their lives or giving them a sense of meaning. And finally, I would say Joe Biden doesn't really talk very much or seem to have much of a feel for the real dangers of the partisanship and the polarization, not just in politics, but in media. And of all the people to get elected, you think about his four predecessors, Trump, Obama, Bush, Clinton, all of those guys ran as outsiders. The one modern exception really is George H.W. Bush. He's very much like Biden, a very similar resume, former 8-year vice president, a former member of Congress. Bush also had experience with national security and foreign policy as Joe Biden did. Very similar resumes. And he ran pretty much as Joe Biden did, as someone who knew how to work the levers of government. But if you go back before that, Reagan, Carter, I would argue to some extent, even Nixon, even Johnson, Kennedy, Eisenhower, all of them were to some extent outsiders, not necessarily populists, but they didn't run as creatures of Washington. And that's what Joe Biden largely ran as. And so that to me is the environment. You can think about Joe Biden's challenge in dealing with the pandemic for sure. You can think about his challenge in dealing with the economic fallout of the pandemic. But to me, the biggest challenge he faces, and the one both biographically and in terms of knowledge, I think, as well as his instinct, he may be least equipped to do, is to understand the big bad four and to try to figure out how to address it. Because while we could have a successful country in the abstract without meeting those challenges and addressing them, I think it'll be super difficult. Gridlock in Washington, and a sense of alienation from our big institutions, from big government, from big media, from big tech. No, there's no denying that part of why people went to Trump rallies, part of why people went to Sanders rallies, is they wanted to feel like something bigger than themselves. And those events did that for them. Joe Biden, because of the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, if you go back to his events when he was running for the Democratic nomination, he's not the leader of a movement like Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, or even, I would say, to some extent, Trump's three predecessors. He is very much an establishmentarian. And as I said, the challenge he faces now is how does someone with his background, his instincts, his sensibilities, how does he confront the nation's challenges, which are tough right now, without exhibiting a better understanding, a better feel for the big bad four than I think he's shown previously. And that's a challenge for the Democratic Party. Joe Biden is, I'll say again, he is not a populist. In preparation for tonight, we looked for what we thought would be sort of his most fiery populist moment as a presidential candidate. And this is what we came up with.
Folks, this election is a choice between Scranton and Park Avenue values, between Cleveland and Park Avenue balance. But it's also about something deeper. Can these parents look their kids in the eye and say, honey, everything's going to be okay? I'll fight for American jobs with the dignity of work and make the wealthy and corporations begin to pay their fair share. I'll protect your right to health care and build on and improve the Affordable Care Act. And I'll always tell you the truth. I'll always care about you whether you vote for me or not. If elected, I'm not going to be a Democratic president. I'm going to be an American president. Whether you voted for me or not, I'm going to be your president. And I'll never forget the people, the working people of this country, because that's what I come from.
Now, you might think that's a man who's fired up and ready to go, but I would tell you that that sounded to my ear, compared to some recent political leaders in this country, to be a little bit rote. And because Joe Biden faced very few tough questions during this campaign, there are a lot of things related to the Big Bad Four that I, as someone who's covered him now for more than 2 decades, I have no idea where Joe Biden stands in his head and in his heart. What does he really think about Facebook and the power of social media? What does he really think about the connection between international trade deals and the loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States? What does he really feel about the way to restore meaning to people's lives in this country? What does he really feel about the question of, is it possible to reduce the level of polarization and partisanship? He talks about wanting to be president for all the people. He talks about wanting to reach out to people who didn't vote for him. But could he really go and talk to Trump supporters and understand them? Does he really have a feel for that? Very few people in his party do, in my experience. It's not an easy thing to come up with. But there are plenty of people around Joe Biden who think that Hillary Clinton's description of Trump supporters as deplorables is way too nice. There are plenty of people around Joe Biden who basically want to write off the 73 million or so people. There are plenty of people around Joe Biden who want to go after Facebook. There are plenty of people around Joe Biden who think we're not going to have manufacturing jobs in this country anymore, and we better figure out a way around that. I don't know where Joe Biden stands on these things, and I think we're about to find out in a very tough environment for his party. I don't think it's likely that they'll hold the 2 Senate seats in Georgia. And if they don't, I think it's going to be quite a challenge for him to govern. He's got an incredible heart. He has a real understanding of Washington circa 1982. Does he have a real understanding of Washington circa 2021? I really don't know. But I can tell you that nothing he had to go through to attain the presidency, I think, showed us or showed him his capacity to address the Big Bad Four. Finally, I'll just talk about the Republicans and where they go now. It all will continue to revolve around Donald Trump until it doesn't. I see no reason to think that he won't keep open the possibility of running in 4 years. I continue to believe that we just don't know how big a variable the prospect of prosecution, indictment, and prosecution weighs in his mind, how likely it is. But if he's able to avoid that somehow, in terms of federal prosecution and state prosecution, then I think that the Republican Party is going to be, as we've already seen in this transition period, loath to cross him. People ask me again all the time about Donald Trump. What do Republicans really think about him? In private, what do Republicans who support him in public, what do they say about him privately? And I pretty much give the same answer, which is all you have to do is listen closely. Listen to what some of them said 4 years ago.
Donald Trump is a jerk.
Thank you.
So he's doing this to inflame and to incite and to draw attention, which seems to be his organizing principle of his campaign.
You cannot insult your way to the presidency. You can't disparage women, Hispanics, disabled people. Who is he kidding?
I think really there's a sophomore quality that is entertaining about Mr. Trump, but I am worried. I'm very concerned about having him in charge of the nuclear weapons, because I think his response, his visceral response to attack people on their appearance, short, tall, fat, ugly. My goodness, that happened in junior high. Are we not way above that? And would we not all be worried to have someone like that in charge of the nuclear arsenal?
And my concern is that he would grab up that power and really treat the country as sort of his little bully fiefdom. But I think eventually it's going to wear thin. All this sort of false bravado and all this bluster. I mean, aren't people eventually going to say, does the emperor have any clothes, or does the emperor have a brain, frankly? I mean, people are going to finally say, say, what is he really saying when he says, well, I must be smart because I'm rich? Is that really a logical statement to make? Are we really going to accept that?
Donald Trump has created a toxic environment.
He offers a barking carnival act that can best be described as Trumpism. A toxic mix of demagoguery and mean-spiritedness and nonsense that will lead the Republican Party to perdition if pursued.
The country, I'm going to tell you what I really think of Donald Trump. This man is a pathological liar. He doesn't know the difference between truth and lies. He lies practically every word that comes out of his mouth. And in a pattern that I think is straight out of a psychology textbook, his response is to accuse everybody else of lying. He accuses everybody on that debate stage of lying. And it's simply a mindless yell. Whatever he does, he accuses everyone else of doing. The man cannot tell the truth, but he combines it with being a narcissist. A narcissist at a level I don't think this country's ever seen.
Now, you might say that those are people who were running against him and they just said what they needed to do to beat him. I would tell you that back then and through the entire Trump presidency, that's what most Republican elected officials, most Republican strategists, most Republican donors, and certainly almost everyone who's ever done business with Donald Trump thinks about it. And yet they basically let him be the leader of the Republican Party. They just let him pick the next chair of the National Party. He's almost certainly going to stay on his chair. He continues to control the Republican Party. And I would say, when people say, how could that be? I would say, go back to the big bad four. He is a better populist than any of them. He offered a theory of the case on the economy. You may not think the economy was doing particularly well before the pandemic, but by some measures, it certainly was. And some Democrats back then acknowledged that it was. So a theory of the case on the economy, a tough populism, his rallies and his presence on television gave his supporters, tens of millions of them, a sense of belonging to something, of having meaning in their life. And then finally, never has there been a better exploiter of partisanship and polarization, including in the media, than Donald Trump. Those are powerful tools that he had. And there's no one in the party over the last 4 years, there's no one in the party now, even those who would like to run for president, who come close to his understanding of and ability to manipulate the big bad four. And I think that even out of office, Donald Trump will have a better handle on how to manipulate those things than Republicans who are in office, and then to some extent, a better understanding than Joe Biden. Joe Biden is going to bring a lot to this job, and everyone on this meeting wishes him well. But the challenge he faces in trying to address legislation, foreign affairs, keeping the heart and soul of the country moving in the same direction without demonstrating a greater knowledge of how to address the big bad four, I think is the challenge as I see it, defining his presidency when he takes the oath of office on January 20th. I'm going to stop there, in part because I want to make sure we leave enough time for questions, and in part because I'm always worried someone's going to unmute and yell out, "You lie," which always throws me off just a little bit. I thank you for joining, and I will turn it now over to Paul to officiate here questions from you as we head here to the Q&A. So thank you again.
Sonia, you're up first.
This is an absolute pleasure to get to talk to you. My question.
Nice to join. Thank you.
Thank you. My question would be more towards white evangelical Christians and their seemingly hypocrisy when it seems to me that they really care about the unborn, but the rest of the lives don't matter to them. So they don't care about the Affordable Care Act or health care for everyone. They don't seem to care about the redlining, which reduces the cost in communities of color. They don't seem to care about property taxes being associated with education. And with all of that, to me, that's being pro-life. So talk to us about why evangelicals get stuck on one thing and why they're always saying Dems are baby killers when we're just saying, hey, give people a choice. Let that be between them and God.
That is a really good question, and I would say really more of a doctoral thesis than a true-false question. But let me try a stab at it. Look, what you're describing has certainly been the view, and I think in many cases the accurate view of Democrats for a long time, and some Republicans. And there are some Republicans, and I think it's a movement that is going to now have a bit of a comeback, even as Donald Trump remains the dominant force in the party, that say exactly what you say, which is to be a true Christian, to be a true person of faith, to be a true person of life, you need to worry about the lives of everyone, not just of those who are not born. And I think that the coarseness of our society and the tribalism of our politics and our media have really drowned that out. And if you think about the Democratic Party, you can think of comparable situations on some issues. But I agree with you that type of Republican, which is a perfectly consistent position, as you suggest, has been largely absent. And I would say again, as President Trump leaves office, not entirely leaves the stage, but I think you've seen in reaction to that people like Mike Gerson, who worked for President Bush. If you're not familiar with his writings, I suggest you take a look. He's someone who's talked about a lot of the issues you've talked about, and talked about a conservative agenda, a Republican agenda that subsumes many of the issues that you listed off. That he would agree with you, would demonstrate a support for life in a much broader sense. And it'll be interesting to see, as there are other candidates for president in the Republican side, as other Republican leaders, governors, maybe members of Congress, as they step forward, whether people do address that agenda. Because not only is it a matter of a lot of the issues you listed, a matter of economic and societal fairness and justice, but I think for a lot of people, there's a populist and an appeal to those, because there's nothing more populist than saying the powerful and the status quo need to change. And that people who, for instance, don't have access to fair housing, equal access to housing, for instance, just to take one of the issues you named, or healthcare, that those are very, very populist issues. And there's a strain of populism in the Republican Party that I think, separate from Donald Trump, really does believe in those. So I think you're right that they've been absent. And I hope, because I'd like to see lots of different voices, I hope they become part of the debate going forward. Thank you for your question and for joining tonight.
Thanks, Mark. John, do you have a question?
I do. Mark, thank you for this, and thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. Here's a question. I hope it's a true and false one. True or false, the Democrats giving up the ground game during the election pandemic by relying on television ads, phone banking, but not working on voter registration and not knocking on doors. They saw those results, particularly in the down ballot races this year.
Yeah. John, it's a great question, and thank you for asking and for joining the call tonight. You know, in my career, as the things have gotten more partisan, there's rarely agreement between Democrats and Republicans. But throughout my career, people in both parties have said, to use the football analogy, which they always did, that the ground game is worth a field goal. That if you've got a superior ground game, that you're going to get 3 points additional turnout in the polls. In this case, we had an unprecedented situation, as your question suggested. We had one side with not just a robust ground game, but the one that literally began the year the president was inaugurated. They filed for re-election on the day he was inaugurated. And they knew that the only way they would win would be to have a robust ground game, working the field to try to turn out new people who didn't vote for the president 4 years ago. And on the other side, as you suggested, you basically had an entire general election from the spring through election day, where Democrats barely did any of that, what is considered a pretty basic in politics. The Biden campaign's campaign manager was someone who grew up in the field part of politics, who understands the ground game so well. And I think there's a great article or maybe even book to be written about how she used her expertise within the confines of the pandemic to try to, use technology to produce as robust a ground game as possible. But I believe you're right. The premise of your question is right. Not just down ballot, but I think Joe Biden's margins in states he won were smaller than they would have been. I think there's some states he lost that she could have won, like North Carolina. And if Democrats had lost this race at the presidential level, there would have been a lot of second guessing on that point, I think, as much as any other, because there were ways to try to have a field operation and still follow the advisories of the medical community. Down ballot's a little bit trickier. I think that in most states you've got a shared, coordinated campaign, and those efforts would have been coordinated. Were Democrats in Maine, not turning out for Susan, to beat Susan Collins, but were turning out to support Joe Biden? We're going to have to figure that out and try to understand what happened. But I don't think there's any doubt that was a fateful decision, which hurt Democrats down ballot, made the election closer than it might otherwise have been. I think it's part of why the polling seemed to be off in the minds of a lot of people. And I think had Joe Biden lost, as I said, I think that would have been probably the biggest factor, certainly one of the biggest factors, along with Biden's own limited campaigning, that people would have pointed to say, whoa, we cost ourselves the election by fateful choices. Thank you for your question. Paul, next question, please.
Yeah, we have a question from Josh in Riverside.
Now that we're in such a polarized time, Biden's really stuck in the middle here. And is he going to face a bigger problem from dealing with Mitch McConnell or from the left?
Well, I think potentially both, but in the short term, assuming Democrats don't win both Georgia Senate seats, I think Mitch McConnell. I read with great humor and head shaking this notion that Mitch McConnell's going to think all of a sudden that it's in his political interest to help a Democratic president get things done. I don't think he'll think that any more than he did for Barack Obama. And I think that that Republicans, you saw today, Republicans on Monday announced the fundraising committee to help them hold those Georgia Senate seats. And it is a who's who of big people in the Republican Party: Chris Christie, Karl Rove, a bunch of other prominent Republicans. They know that they need to control the Senate, or things will be dramatically different for the Republican agenda and the conservative agenda. I don't know what the liberal progressive wing of the Democratic Party is going to do. If Joe Biden starts to try to make deals with Republicans, which he will have to do if he's going to pass anything, if McConnell is the majority leader, I don't know. The left is talking differently. There's no doubt that on issues like immigration, on healthcare, on social justice issues, on racial justice issues, there's no doubts that the progressive community, certainly in retrospect and to some extent in real time, looked at the performance of the Obama-Biden administration and said, this isn't the kind of progressive administration we thought we were getting. This isn't the kind of progressive administration we need. And they put down a much bigger marker here to say to Joe Biden, we expect you to govern in a very progressive fashion on a range of issues. And to the extent he took positions different from Barack Obama and from the administration in which he served during the campaign, they were to move to the left, not as far to the left as Bernie Sanders, but certainly to the left. So I think the answer to your question is Joe Biden's going to have a Mitch McConnell problem, even if Democrats are in the majority in the Senate, which I don't think will happen. But if they are, he's going to have a Mitch McConnell problem of sorts. If McConnell's in the majority, that'll be a bigger problem for him. How big a problem progressives and the left will be, I don't know. I know what they say they're going to do, but I also know, again, how tribal our politics is. And I think that more likely than not, Joe Biden is going to have the support of a lot of elected officials. And I think they're going to do their best to say, we can't effectively fight Mitch McConnell if we're divided in our own house. That's my guess is what he'll do. But I take the left at their word that they're going to be extremely fierce in holding his feet to the fire. And I think we'll see that in the next few weeks. I think the Biden folks think they can cleverly name slates of nominees for cabinet and other senior positions that include a mixture of moderates and more progressive figures. And I'm not sure that the left is going to tolerate that. What they can do about it is an interesting question. But I think you're going to see a lot more tension between Joe Biden and the left than you saw with either Bill Clinton or Barack Obama. Thank you for your question, Paul.
We have Kasha up next.
My question is even if, say, for say that we do actually, the Democrats actually do get the Senate, do we think that we're going to be able to compromise? Do you think that the Republicans are going to be able to compromise with the Democrats? I mean, they say one thing and then they do another. I just want to know why everyone expects the Democrats to compromise, but the Republicans are not willing to do so.
Right. Well, I think in general, you're not going to find a more uncompromising figure than Mitch McConnell in either party. And I think McConnell's staff would tell you that, and they would tell you that proudly. Joe Biden does have a history of working with Mitch McConnell during the Obama years. He was on several high-profile occasions sent to Capitol Hill to work with McConnell on a deal. I think people overstate their actual friendship. I don't think they have a friendship. I think they have an understanding, and they have in the past. I will tell you that if you go back just a few weeks ago, Republicans were offering to do a stimulus, pandemic relief measure that basically had all the things the two sides agreed on, plus some of the things the Democrats wanted, and some of the things the Republicans wanted. But largely they were saying, let's pass the things we agree on. And Nancy Pelosi would not compromise on that. Over the years, we've seen times where I think an immigration deal was possible. but it's Democrats who said, no, we're not going to compromise. So I don't think it's accurate to say that Democrats are the ones who always are willing to compromise. But again, I'll say Mitch McConnell is certainly as uncompromising a figure as you'll find. That is part of the challenge. And it's part of what comes directly out of the big bad four. It's tougher to compromise during difficult economic times. It's tougher to compromise with a populist because compromises by definition are made by politicians who are, in most cases, establishment figures. It's tougher to compromise when people are looking for meaning in their lives, and their meaning to some extent comes from the tribe that they're in, whether it's the blue tribe or the red tribe. And it's tougher to compromise when you've got a polarized system where the loudest voices in the national town square and angriest voices are the most dominant. So Joe Biden, you saw in the clip I played from 4 years ago, you saw throughout his campaign, even when he was fighting to win the Democratic nomination, he made compromise and his capacity to bring it about the centerpiece of his credentials of how he could do it. But I think it's going to be a real challenge. I hope I'm wrong. I hope it turns out to be super easy, but it's going to be difficult. And McConnell is very good at figuring out where can he stand? Where can he plant the flag to say, I'm where the American people are? And I think to some extent he did that on his final bid in the fall over coronavirus relief measures. I think he was more where the American people were, and certainly more where the traffic would bear. And Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer were the ones who wouldn't compromise. So that's going to be interesting to see. And we're going to see it in the lame duck session as there's another attempt to do that. We'll see it with the president's elect cabinet nominees. There's going to be a lot of opportunities for both sides to demonstrate, are they willing and able to compromise? And I think it's going to be a challenge. But in the end, it's up to the president. And in this case, the president-elect, starting in January, to figure out how can he do the very difficult thing, always difficult, but particularly difficult now in this environment, which is to try to create compromise in a time of a lot of tension.
Is that the best example for our children?
No, it's not. And I think that, leaving President Trump's own personal style, I'll say, aside, I don't think we've set a good example going back to the Clinton years. And you can go back even farther to some extent. We have lost the capacity to compromise. I attribute it largely to the big bad four, but there's some other factors as well. But it's a horrible thing to try to explain to a child or to someone visiting from another country. But what gives me the least hope, what concerns me the most, is, as I said, in Clinton, Bush, and Obama, we couldn't have had more qualified people to try to do it. They totally understood it. They thought it was important to change, not just for symbolism and for the sense of comedy, but for the sense of actually getting things done. And each of them failed largely. They had some successful moments, but each of them, to a large extent, failed. So no, I don't think it's great for our children. I think it'll be difficult for our children and our grandchildren to explain it to future generations and to each other of how a country facing a pandemic, pretty broad agreement about, for instance, on policing reform, and how there was no barriers except for human barriers to passing legislation that would help the real lives of real people, and we failed to do it. I don't think that's a great example for our children. As I said, I think it's going to be hard to explain to future generations. Thank you for your question. Appreciate it. Paul.
Thanks, Mark. We've got a question from John.
Yes, Mark, we have obviously been discussing as a country since the election, quote, how polling has, quote, failed once again, although we must note that the polling on the national race seemed to be rather accurate. There were a number of many discrepancies between what the polling results forecasts were and the results were. So I was wondering, in short, to make my question short, if you could comment on what you think the future of polling is, what remedies may or may not be implementable to improve the outlook for better forecasting in the future. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. I'm a little bit of an outlier on this question, as I was 4 years ago. I don't think the polling was that wrong 4 years ago, and I don't think it was that wrong this time. I think what was wrong was people's reading of the polls. Now, it is the case, and this is somewhat at odds with my central point, but the polls are cheaper than they used to be. They're done in an inexpensive way. It's more difficult to poll now than it's been in the past. People who are serious about polling, particularly in individual states like Wisconsin, like Florida, they should scrap national polls and they should put more money into doing larger sample state polls. But here's why I think the polls were more misread than misdone. If you look at the end of the election, not the snapshot 3 weeks out, but the trend lines of where the valuable polls were. Not every poll that gets done and averaged by these sites that average polls, but polls with credible methodology. You take my 3-point field goal for the Trump ground game. You take the reality that it's very difficult to find likely voters if they're first-time voters. Not impossible, but it's difficult. And so if you said, well, a lot of Trump support is going to come from first-time voters who may not show up in likely voter polls in screens. If you take that 3 points, and if you take the reality that these polls have pretty big margins of error, the polls weren't that off, even in individual states. And I could walk you through, the 10 or so states that most mattered in the outcome that were most closely watched. And in all but 1 or 2 cases, I would argue that if you read the polls in a sophisticated way, if you only looked at the ones that were done with good methodology, they just weren't that off. And so to kind of make the story of polling in 2020 as it was in 2016, there was this catastrophic system failure. The whole industry needs to be rethought. I just don't think that's the right lesson. I do think, as I suggested, it needs to be rethought. They need to spend more money, fewer national polls, more state polls, longer questionnaires, a better feel for the electorate in each individual state. I think all those things would produce better polls and better crosstabs, better demographic and geographic data. But in terms of just the horse race, go look at the final polls that were done in a sophisticated way. Think about that 3-point field goal. Think about the margin of error. They just weren't that off. And I think to create this notion that all these pollsters need to go back and rethink everything, I just don't think it's right. And I know I'm a pretty lonely voice with that position, but it was my position 4 years ago, and I'm sticking to it for another 4 years. Thank you. Paul, have time for a couple more, please.
Great. We've got Ray with a question.
Here is my true-false question for you. Going after Trump's taxes and anything else the Democrats would like to extract their pound of flesh for will hurt the Democrats more than it will help them.
I don't think there's a good answer I can give to that one, even if I just stick with true or false. I get the point of your question, and I think that there's a part of me that says there's nothing more important for the country now in terms of not politics, not what to discuss on cable news, not what to write in my newsletter, but in terms of addressing the pandemic, racial justice, the economy. There's nothing more important than getting as high a percentage of the 73 million people who voted for the president to accept the fact that Joe Biden won and to be open to his agenda. I think that's really what I think the most important thing. And I think continuing to try to put Donald Trump in media or actual prison probably doesn't further that important aim. At the same time, I think that it's important to go back to setting example for our children. At the same time, if someone's committed crimes, if someone who's been president has committed crimes, to just walk away and drop it, I think is not a great thing either. So I would say, as a matter of public policy, I count myself as torn on that question. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be up to Ray and Mark. I think it's going to be up to partisan Democrats who are going to do it. And a lot of what the Democratic Party has done and will do in the next few weeks, like a lot of what the Republican Party does, I think it may not be in the long-term interest of themselves or of the country, but I think they'll probably do it no matter what, because I think, if there was an envelope somewhere that said whether Oswald acted alone, you think politicians would just say, yeah, let's move on? No, they'd go get the envelope. There's an envelope with Donald Trump's tax returns in it, and I think Democrats want to see it. We're going to continue now. Paul, next question, please.
Thanks, Mark. Ford, are you ready with your question?
You bet, Mark. I'm here in deep red Texas. Houston, where I live, is not quite as red as it used to be, but nevertheless, Donald Trump, of course, is already teasing running in 2024 and wants to freeze, I'm sure, the field for the Republican nomination. I'll give this to you in true or false. Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton, Nikki Haley, or somebody else will say, nope, I'm not freezing my candidacy. I'm running. I can't wait until 2028.
That is, I think, a hugely important and interesting question. And I think that it's going to depend on what exactly Trump does. I'll tell you what I picked up in the last couple of days is it's appeared to most people in Republican politics that the president is going to freeze the field to some extent. I normally try to shy away from all sports metaphors. I already used a football one, but since you're a Texan, I feel it's okay. I think some of the candidates and would-be candidates are relieved because I think Tom Cotton in particular, Ted Cruz in particular, were going to be and may still be super aggressive. You saw them in Iowa. You see Tom Cotton running an ad with, he's paying for it in Georgia. Tom Cotton in particular, I think, is going to be a super fast pace setter if Trump gets out of the way. And I think some people like a Nikki Haley, like a Governor DeSantis, maybe like your governor in Texas, who want to think about running, but they don't think, right now that they want to start raising money or going to Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. So I think some of them will be relieved and will maybe kid themselves into thinking, you know what, Donald Trump says he's going to do it, but in the end he won't. So there'll be room. And in fact, it might be good because he's going to kind of freeze things a little bit. They may be kidding themselves because I think Donald Trump's, more likely to run than not at this point, but he could have legal trouble. He could decide, there are other things he'd rather do. But right now, I think you named two of the three who I think are the most well-positioned: Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. I forget, you named one of the other two. I think
Nikki
those
Haley
two right now are the ones who I think have the most support. If you think about, again, their fingertip deal for the Big Bad Four, their relationship with both grassroots and potentially bundling donors, I think those three have a leg up right now. But there's 18 other names that are not too far behind them. I don't think any of them are prohibitive favorite. For years in the Republican Party, if you wanted to be the presidential nominee, you had to be one of three things. You had to be the incumbent or former vice president. You had to be the person who finished second in the previous round, or you had to have the last name Bush. Trump broke the mold on that. And so now we don't know what is the path to the Republican nomination. Is it through reality TV? Is it through populism? Is it through anger? Is it through appearing over and over on conservative cable TV? We just don't know right now because Trump has so changed the game of how people conceive of the Republican Party. But I think that if he's being aggressive, if he's out there basically saying, I'm the president in exile, I'm going to run, to go to the heart of your question, I don't know that anybody will challenge him directly. But I think it's relatively easy because you've got governor's races. New Hampshire has a governor's race every 2 years. It's the only state with 2-year terms, or one of two states with 2-year terms. So you can go to New Hampshire and campaign. There's a Senate race there as well, I believe. You can go to Iowa and campaign. There's a governor's race. So I think you'll see people be active, but maybe not being totally genuine about their motives. But for a lot of them, I do think he'll freeze the field. And to have his handpicked person at the RNC, which controls so much of the apparatus in the early parts of the quadrennial cycle, I think it's a big advantage. And I think the person who it freezes, of course, most of all is Mike Pence, who would like to run. But as long as Trump's making noises, I don't see that happening at all. Thank you for the question. I appreciate it.
You bet.
Craig, fire away with your question.
The question that I would have, it's a two-parter. One being, hopefully soon, after we get past make transition past pandemic, what degree of Biden's presidency will be guided towards what he wants to do versus laying the groundwork for the future? Mm-hmm. Because, for all intents and purposes, I don't think anyone's under any misconception that he's most likely a one-term president, just based on age. How much of it is doing what he wants versus kind of, again, laying the groundwork for the future and whoever comes after. And then the other is the over-under for the Georgia race, 500 million?
Well, I'll take the second one first. There's only so many dollar bills you can squeeze into a 1.5 month bag. So I don't think money will be a problem on the Republican side. The Democrats are suffering a little bit of disappointment because you looked at how well funded their Senate candidates were in places like Maine and South Carolina and Iowa, and they came up short, North Carolina. So I don't know that they're going to be able to raise quite as much, but there won't be a lot of ads for Christmas products on Atlanta TV in the run up to the 25th of December. You're going to see a lot of political ads and a lot of negative ones, some positive ones, but your figure, I think, is probably on target, assuming they can figure out how to spend it. At some point, again, there's diminishing returns.
Politicians know how to spend money. I'm not worried about that.
Yeah, it's just you can only buy so much, and as you know, Facebook has shut down the ability to buy political ads, at least so far, and so that restricts one big pot where they just would have flooded the thing. In terms of the Biden prospect of agenda and running again, I'll tell you, nobody thought Hillary Clinton was going to run again. Nobody thought Joe Biden was going to run this time. If you go back 4 years, I say this all the time to folks who say, well, so-and-so is not going to run. Same with John McCain, which is I have never seen anyone in my career in either party who had a decent shot or better than decent shot to be their party's nominee who passed. Never seen it. And that includes passing for age. So there's no doubt in my mind, and you saw that, I think, if you were watching closely, the clip we played at the top of Joe Biden from 4 years ago. There's no doubt in my mind he's not exactly the same guy he was 4 years ago. But that's not to say that he won't be in a strong enough position physically, mentally, and politically to run in 4 years. And if his sister, who's his closest political advisor, said the other day, well, he'll run again if he plans to run again. That may just be something to say. And Biden's smart enough to know that if he declares that he's a lame duck at any point, that's going to diminish his influence. There's a school of thought, and McCain toyed with this when he thought about declaring that he would be a one-term president if he won in 2008. There's a school of thought that says, well, if you say you're a lame duck, you're liberated and you can make deals with people. Most people I know in politics don't think that's true. They think, there's a reason why lame ducks are called lame ducks. And so what I could easily see happening is Joe Biden keeps up what people treat as a pretense for 4 years. Yeah, I'm going to run again. Yeah, I'm going to run again. And it doesn't even have to be for 4 years. We get past the 2022 midterms. If things are going well, he's not going to then at that point say, well, now I'm a lame duck. I think he's going to keep up the pretense and say, well, if I have every intention of running again. And at some point that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because as long as he doesn't take himself out, I don't think anybody's going to challenge him. And like I said, I think it's going to be politically unwise in the view of his team to say he's a lame duck. So I wouldn't rule out as much as people do that he's going to run in 4 years. I think it's a real possibility, assuming he feels up to it.
I was going to say, do the American people have the stomach for a 82-year-old candidate?
We've got other industrialized democracies, Japan in particular, that often will pick super old folks to be in charge. I think it just depends on how he does. If he's a successful president and he's communicating to the country as, grandfather in chief, and his policies are smart and the Republican Party's in disarray, sure. I don't think it's absurd at all to say that Joe Biden would not be a formidable candidate. Trump is only the third elected incumbent in 100 years or so to lose re-election. Normally incumbents get re-elected, and Biden would do a better job of figuring out how to leverage incumbency. I talked to a lot of Democrats who say if Trump had done 4 minor things differently, he probably would have won, even with the pandemic. So he really gave away the benefits of incumbency by mismanaging the pandemic, amongst other things, and alienating suburban voters amongst in other ways, some by the same action. So I think if Biden does a good job, I don't have doesn't require vast imagination for me to see him running again in 4 years and winning.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Pat, you're a go with Mark.
Hello, Mark. This is Pat Lynch from Georgia. And
great to see you, Pat, center of the universe.
Yeah, that's exactly. I want to ask your prediction for the 2 Senate races. I mean, so much matters on that, and you kind of hinted that the Dems won't carry both. So I want to hear your thinking on that.
Yeah, I mean, my view of how uphill it'll be for Democrats is based on 3 things primarily. One is the history of runoffs in Georgia, as you know, and most people here know. Republicans just do well in runoffs,
right.
And I'd add to that as reason one is the recent history of statewide. You haven't elected very many Democrats statewide in Georgia in a good long time, so that's one. 2 is, the Republican candidates want their national leaders, including the president, to come in.
Right.
They just do. You don't hear a lot of Democrats clamoring for Joe Biden to come in.
Mm-hmm.
And there's all sorts of reasons for that, but I don't think they speak well of the Democratic Party's chances of holding these seats.
Mm-hmm.
And then the last thing is, I don't think the 2 Democratic candidates have been superstar candidates.
Yeah.
I think they've been good. My general rule throughout my career in evaluating Senate races has been to say that an incumbent candidate of either party who's well funded and runs aggressively
Right.
almost never loses to even an A candidate. Almost never. And if it's a B or C candidate, they never lose. And that's why I was much more bullish on the Republicans' chances this cycle, because I looked at Tillis in North Carolina, Collins in Maine, at Ernst in Iowa. And Cornyn in Texas. Yeah. They were well-funded candidates who raised a lot of money and didn't take anything for granted. And were fits with the state. They're not out of step with their states. I'd say the two Republicans are not great candidates.
Yeah.
And that's the main reason I think they might lose. I could see either one of them making a big mistake. They're not great candidates, but they are incumbents. One's an appointed, as you know, one's elected. But I just don't see how I'll be generous and say they're B candidates, but I think one of them at least is a C candidate. I just don't see how two weak, challenging candidates are going to be two Southern Republican candidates when the Republican Party is all hands on deck. And if there was a chance right now that Republicans thought they would lose this, Mitch McConnell would be, looking a little bit more upset than he looks. So I don't know too many Democrats. In fact, I only know one that I know of who thinks the Democrats are going to win them both.
Yeah.
So that's the sum total of my reporting. Like I said, the escape hatch I'm giving myself is if either of these Republicans, because now they're so tied together because they're campaigning together, but if either of them make a colossal error, and I could see it happening, then I think they can be beaten. But if they play it safe, and you saw, they're not keen on debating. They're keen on appearing at big rallies with prominent national figures. If they keep that up, I think they'll probably win them both. And I think that most Democrats I know think that as well.
Was it a big enough error when they attacked the Secretary of State, and wanted him to resign? Fellow Republican.
Yeah, I mean, I know the national media didn't like that.
Yeah. Georgia didn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what makes you say Georgia didn't like it?
No, Georgia, it didn't matter that much.
Yeah,
actually,
it's inside baseball for most Georgia voters, I think. And look, in a traditional runoff, and the reason why Republicans tend to win runoffs in the South, it's a turnout for the base. And I think they did that primarily to get the president on their side. And Democrats said about all these down ballot races, if we have record turnout, we're going to win. And they did in a few places, but for the most part, they didn't. So I don't think calling for the resignation of a Republican Secretary of State matters to anybody but the president and some activists. And right now, that's who they want on their side. The minute you hear either of the Democratic candidates say, we want Joe Biden here, I'll revise and extend my remarks. But right now, they don't seem to want him there, and that tells me something.
All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Sorry about those who didn't get their questions in. I know some of you are pretty regular email correspondents of mine, so I'll expect an email with your question by the time I get back to my laptop. But thank you all again for joining us. We appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed participating in this town hall, and we hope if we do more, you'll join us for those as well. Thank you very much, and good night.